Very good. So it works. It seems to work. So I can actually start. Yes. So wait a minute. I just make this more. Good. So welcome to my lecture on the so-called sweet medicine Sundance path. The preparation was a bit difficult because I got a cold last Thursday, and since then I'm more or less struggling and tried to finish this, and so the lecture may actually be a bit unsystematic maybe. And it's so much material and I'm still struggling to really understand this movement that I'm studying. So this is really also a work in progress presentation. It's also my very first presentation on this movement, and it's really a complex thing, as you will hopefully understand. And I can already say now that I will probably need 45 minutes rather than 30 minutes. So, okay, now I move to this screen. Okay, table of contents. I will begin with some introductory remarks, obviously. Then I will try to give a brief overview of the movement. And then I will go into some greater depth with regard to one particular ceremony this group practices, namely the Sundance. And then I will end with some concluding remarks. Klar. Mal den Taler. Good. So the Sweet Medicine Sundance Path is a rather small grouping founded around 1975 with a few thousand practitioners worldwide. Based mostly in North America, and they're in Arizona, in Europe, especially in the German-speaking countries, and in Great Britain and in Italy, but it's basically all over Europe. There are lodges all over Europe. And then there is a lodge in Australia. I started fieldwork. Oh, sorry. I have to make it small so that you can see everything. Good. I started fieldwork in this movement in 2019 and deepened my involvement this year, since April more or less. It is my first real fieldwork experience, so I'm learning by doing. And the Sweet Medicine Sundance Path has run completely under the radar of scholarship until now. There's not even one article or book or encyclopedia entry on this movement, so I may be the first scholar reporting on this. And there begins the problem, namely how to classify this movement. I have four options. I could either consider it a new religious movement, so-called NRM, a neo-shamanic movement, a neo-magical movement, or a Neo-Amerindian movement. And there are reasons for all these four options. First of all, if we see it as a new religious movement, it makes sense because the Sweet Medicine Sundance Path has a charismatic founder, Harley Swifty Reagan, who I will present shortly, is highly syncretistic, and in this, it is clearly a child of its time, the 1970s, and they even do this self-consciously or deliberately. They call it twisted hairs. I will go into this later. And more or less, the historical claims cannot be verified before the 1970s. So these are typical characteristics of new religious movements. We could also call it a neo-shamanic movement because, oops, one second. The founder claims Cherokee and, no, that's wrong. He claims Navajo roots. The group uses the word shaman as an emic category, but it reflects on the, let's call it, New Age idea of a globalized shamanism, a shamanism that is more or less has the same core across many cultures, and Yeah, and as I already said, they are highly syncretistic, and these aspects qualified as a so-called neo-shamanic group. I will also explain this in a bit. And then it is clearly a neo-magical movement, because magic is a frequently used emic term. Swifty himself was very well read in Western ritual magic, and he had one of the biggest libraries of Aleister Crowley in his time. He was even a member of various Western ritual magical fraternities, such as the Ordo Templi Orientis. And the Sweet Medicine Sundance Path is also full of magical terminology. So it could also be considered a neo-magical movement. And now comes the tricky part. But before I go into the tricky part, I have to briefly introduce at least the founder to you before we go into the details. Harley Swifty Reagan, or Harley Reagan, was born 1941 in Texas. He died in 2013. In or around 1975, and this is his own story. So it's really difficult to find independent, let's call it independent information about this person, because there are two big camps. One is hardcore polemics against him, people who consider him a fraud, a con man, or a plastic shaman. And then there is his own account, and there is no independent possible source of knowledge. So this is his account. In 1975, Swifty was designated by the elders as one of the carriers of the southwest shields of the Sweet Medicine Sundance wheels and keys. This is his own description. So he claims to have been kind of initiated into a particular group. And he also says that he was born into the Anikawi clan of the Tsalagi Aniyunwia people. So that's a Cherokee clan. And he therefore claims that he's a descendant of Cherokee and Irish parents. He also wrote an autobiography in 1993, where he has long stories about being a Vietnam veteran, but no, as I understand, no one has ever checked this information. What can be verified is that he was a martial arts teacher in Scottsdale in Arizona in the 1970s, and the dojo where he did this is still operative there in Scottsdale. And then I begin again with his own account. He was trained for 6 years by Tom Two Bears Wilson, a Navajo teacher whom he identifies with Don Gennaro from the Carlos Castaneda novels. So he claims to be taught by the same teacher as Carlos Castaneda. I guess you all know who Carlos Castaneda is. Yes, I don't have to go into that. Then around 1986, he founded the so-called Deer Tribe Métis Medicine Society. You also find these terms in the glossary, which is kind of the organization that runs the group. They have a website, and they also organize the big ceremonies. Then he assumed an additional medicine name, Thunderstrike, in 1992. He was a chain smoker and a firearms aficionado. Some called him Shooting Shaman because he did shooting trainings, a lot of shooting trainings, also with his students. He was married twice, lastly to Diane Nightbird, who is still involved in the path today. And he died 2013, and the emic or insider rumor is that he died while practicing a ceremony for creating a second body for himself. That's one of the so-called magical teachings or practices in this path, claiming that you can produce a second body which you can control. A few images. This is in his martial arts times. A bit later, this is kind of a collage made by students. And this is an interesting photo because it's him on the left, but in fact, Tom Wilson is in the middle. And this is a matter of dispute because people claim that he was never trained by Tom Wilson. Now, back to the issue of shamanism. And I go into some detail with this because I relate to Isabel's talk, and I think shaman or shamanism is not a good second order term for our group, because it mixes unclear semantics and political ideologies. So as you know, probably know, shaman originates from the eventuate shaman, so a Siberian word, and designated for one particular small group of people. But in the 1950s and 60s, the term it got an ism and was picked up by anthropologists who described like a generic term. People that do vision seeking, communication with spirits, and we have these tropes like the dream initiation and the death and rebirth scenario and so on. And through this development, eventually the term neo-shamanism emerged, also inspired by countercultural debates of the 1970s, especially in the wake of the works of Carlos Castaneda and Michael Harner. And there the idea was that there is in fact a global or cross-cultural core shamanism that does not necessitate a specific cultural origin. So the term had no trademark in a way, and therefore anyone could use it. And this created a counter-reaction by some indigenous groups who coined the term plastic shamanism. So this is a pejorative term created by various Native American activists and institutions since the 1980s, when more and more white shamans claim to teach traditional ceremony. So we have politics of authenticity here. And to just give a few examples, there have been various Native American associations who have produced lists of plastic shamans in the 1980s, formulated resolutions and even declarations of war. There was a lot of anger involved. They had the feeling that these whites appropriate and rob their sacred ceremonies. But the anger also turned against Native American teachers who actually taught whites or so-called half-bloods for monetary or other purposes. And this was interpreted as a late form of, or a next step in American colonialism, cultural hegemony, and ultimately fraudulence. And so they created these warnings and declarations of war. Be warned that these individuals are moving about playing upon the spiritual needs and ignorance of our non-Indian brothers and sisters. The value of these instructions and ceremonies are questionable, maybe meaningless, and hurtful to the individual carrying false messages. So this is another declaration of war. We hereby declare war against all persons who persisting, exploiting, abusing, and misrepresenting the sacred traditions and spiritual practices of the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people. So there were many of these declarations of war at that time. And in fact, there were militant actions and reactions. They tried to find the white shamans and their groups and the plastic shamans and tried to stop them from practicing sweat lodge ceremonies, for instance. Now, there are two things which are important for me. One is that the development of the sweet medicine Sundance path was influenced by these lists of plastic shamans and the declarations of war. So they changed their strategies. And the other one is that especially Harley Swifty Reagan was heavily attacked. And a huge debate about, well, the authenticity of his practices emerged. As he claimed Cherokee and Navajo roots, he was next to other alleged plastic shamans such as Lynn Andrews, Michael Harner, or Vincent LaDuke, who also ran under the name Sun Bear. He was in the firing line of these Native American associations. In 1992, there was an HBO show on so-called real sex, where Swifty presented their own version of sacred sexuality called Chulukwai Kudoshka. You can also find this in the glossary. And then Native American activists reacted to this show. They wanted to sue HBO and Reagan, and urged him to stop claiming that these sexual practices they do, that they descend from Cherokees. And also Navajo groups and activists urged him to stop claiming that he was actually taught by Tom Wilson, by a traditional Navajo teacher. And probably in order to avoid lawsuits or other attacks, maybe even militant attacks by the Native American community, the Deer Tribe Métis Medicine Society, the parent organization, has stopped claiming Native American roots since that time until today. So when you go onto their website, you will find not much about sweat lodges, no Sundance, and so they kind of try to run under the shadow? No, under the carpet? No. Radar. They try to run under the radar. So the case is in a way not solved, okay? And let's just go into some of the concrete accusations, which might also be interesting. So they argue that he's not a true, authentic teacher because he allows mixed sweat lodges for men and women. He allows menstruating women to participate in sweat lodges. They do sweat lodge and other ceremonies in so-called working cloth. So they do it naked, which is also allegedly not a traditional way of doing it. He doesn't use traditional language, but mostly English. And the Cherokee actually never taught anything about sacred sexuality. Reagan's made it up. We learn about sex like everyone else does behind the barn, said Richard Allen in 2002. Okay, this doesn't work with such a huge screen. Maybe I can change this. Swifty's position, just to do credit to how he sees the stuff, his argument is in the age of, so-called age of Aquarius, so that's 1970s, okay, powerful praxis knowledge like the one he teaches should not be kept hidden in secret traditions anymore. So this is a direct response to his criticizers. To me, only truth and knowledge are sacred. I do not respect a tradition that suppresses knowledge. For him, this is kind of keeping people in ignorance and slavery. When you have the knowledge, you have to share it. The past guilt of white men in the Americas, where he goes into great detail because he really acknowledges he considers himself a Native American, and he acknowledges the awful things that have been done in the history of the Americas. But the past guilt of white men some 100 or 200 years ago should not prevent the teaching of half-bloods or whites in the present. He also has certain prophecies on the table. So he thinks that one day people of all colors will come together and pray together to determine how all people can be helped. And he even thinks that making these teachings available to Métis people, Métis is mixed people, is critical for the planet in order to undo the damage done to the earth. And regarding the sweat lodge problem, which was apparently hugely debated, he has a specific position. He allegedly tried out it with menstruating and without menstruating woman and found out that a menstruating woman is the most powerful person in the sweat lodge because it's the closest to death, because menstruation is the energy of death. And so she attracts all the energy in the sweat lodge. But if the sweat chief knows how to direct the energy, he can include a menstruating woman for using this additional energy in the sweat lodge. So that's kind of an esoteric argument. But of course, the person has to be trained to do that. And regarding the Kudoshka problem or dispute, he simply claims that they come from secret lineages within the Cherokee community. Even if many Cherokees are not aware of this, he claims that there have been secret communities within the Native American lineages who have carried on this knowledge. So now it becomes even more complicated, because Swifty claimed that the teaching come from 12 teaching shields gradually being released by the elders of the Twisted Task Council. What does this mean? So he writes this in his autobiography. He writes, the Twisted Task Council of Elders, the secret group in which he is part of and where he receives the teachings, has its origin in the Canis Major constellation, specifically from the planets within the reaches of the star Sirius. So the knowledge comes from some people outside of our solar system, near the star Sirius, and I meet members of the Twisted Task Council in the 5th dimension to receive sweet medicine Sundance teachings. The 5th dimension is the dimension beyond space and time, where you go into trance, or which you can reach through trance and other techniques, maybe also dream. If you don't believe in the 5th dimension or the dreamscape, you will have a problem with the history of my people. Now, this seems to be like a very weird story to begin with, and one can easily overread it. But as I heard from one of the direct students of Swifty, sorry, he was frequently in the so-called kivas, underground caves, in the wie heißt das? Well, where the Native Americans reside, the reservations, underground cave systems in the reservations. And he, that's the direct quote, downloaded the teachings. So I take this serious because I've read Antave's book, Revelatory Events, 3 case studies on the emergence of new spiritual paths. Anyone know that book? It's a great book. Antaves has been president of the IAHR, if you maybe have heard of her name, the International Association for the History of Religions, and she wrote this book in her time in Erfurt when I was there. And in this book she studies the phenomenon of involuntary channeling. It's called involuntary channeling in the modern New Age jargon, it's called. So people who receive messages without asking for it. There's also voluntary channeling, which is a huge thing on Facebook. Not on, yeah, maybe also on Facebook, but on YouTube. You can get channeled messages from Buddha, Jesus, and who have you every day on YouTube. Fresh messages from people who claim to channel these messages, okay? But then there's also involuntary channeling. People who have no clue what's going on and suddenly have voices in their heads or knowledge or whatever. And her 3 case studies are the book of Mormon. So Mormonism actually stems from the period of channeling, and I think it's quite convincing. The second one is the founding documents of the Anonymous Alcoholics, and the 3rd case study is so-called A Course in Miracles, which is also called a New Age Bible, channeled by Helen Schuckman, a professor of psychology, I think Harvard professor of psychology. She channeled between 1962 and 1967 for several years a very fast voice in her head. And A Course in Miracles eventually is the book that came out of this. And what Taves shows in this book, that it is a real phenomenon. So there are really things going on in the brain, in the mind. It is something is going on. These things are not made up, even though many things happen then in the groups and in the socializing or the social reactions to these revelations. But it is the spark of new religious movements. Not some new religious movements in the 20th century and maybe also earlier. We might have called it prophecy before the 20th century or other forms of divination. Now, I mention this because when I hear that Swiftier downloaded the teachings in the Kivas, it could be something like this for me, because I've now been in the group for several years, and I've seen many things which I've never seen before. So some of the stuff I can relate to other systems of religious knowledge. But then there are theories, teachings, and ceremonies which are completely, they could simply be new. It's simply new religious stuff on earth, channeled from wherever. But I think that cannot be underestimated as a factor. Some notes on methodology. There are only few written publications on the teachings and practices of this group. And it is in large parts really an initiatory and oral tradition. So usually you get teachings in person, in an oral way, and you have to take notes. There are hundreds or even thousands of oral teachings on the theories and practices of this group. The path is extremely complex and time-consuming, which means two things. It is only revealed incrementally to initiates over the course of many years. So even after 20 years, you haven't seen it all. You're somewhere in gate 7 or 8 or 15 in total. So they have an initiatory system of degrees, which they call gates. It's a gateway process. And from a fieldwork perspective, this is of course a problem, because it's only possible to see step-by-step snippets of the full path, but you can only get access to it if you actually take the teachings step by step. It's very different from other potential groups where already a lot of written literature exists, or where some other work has already been done. And then what is also important for me, these conflicts between the Sweet Medicine Science path and the Native American associations, they are of course interesting because they also indicate aspects of our group, what we want to investigate as deviance or resilience. But I do not consider it my own job to evaluate the alleged authenticity or non-authenticity of this group. This is not in my interest. But the political background makes it difficult to do fieldwork, because the elders of this path, and I mean the living elders, the group that leads and makes the big decisions, they still have a strong desire to stay below the radar and, as they understand it, protect the path. And I have handed in a formal request to do fieldwork early this year, but it still remains unanswered. So that's a problem for me, and therefore today I can only present you material taken from published sources. I cannot provide you with pictures from the ceremonies themselves or even interview material, because I still have no official allowance. What is also important is that there is a large amount of extreme polemics against Reagan. So you read really awful stuff in the internet on Reagan, because he's a polemical target of two groups. He's attacked by Native American associations who consider him a plastic shaman, and he's attacked by the so-called anti-cult movement. You may have heard of the anti-cult movement in the USA. They have organizations who trace sects and cults, especially after Jonestown, you know, the mass murders, the various very problematic new religious group massacres in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. And so there are also aggressive anti-cult movements, and these people who write lengthy descriptions of the sweet medicine Sundance path, but they're full of polemics and extremely distortive and misleading. And as I have been in this group for several years, I can see that much of this is not correct from an insider's perspective. So this is, I have also to take this into account. In fact, my own interest, my biggest interest, and there I come from the study of magic, lies in the question of subjective experiences of evidence or efficacy. And I basically have a bigger question in the background, namely how can magic survive, okay, or prevail in a historical context or a cultural context which is hostile, and that's one thing. And second thing is that the claims are often very high and preposterous. So if you really claim that you can become invisible, I mean, someone has to have an experience. Otherwise, it will be discarded by history, I think, sooner or later. But magical recipes, they have been transmitted since millennia, and one of my explanations is actually that people have subjective experience of evidence. And I distinguish three domains. One is that these practices actually affect contingent life events. So magic works in a way, so wish fulfillment, rituals for wish fulfillment do work, whatever that means, whatever work means. It could just be a retrospective ascription of an event to a ritual. The event might have happened anyway. For instance, you make a money ritual and then you win in the lottery. That's a very stereotypical example because in reality it never works that way, at least not that way. But still, then the person would retrospectively ascribe the lottery win to the ritual and thereby ascribe efficacy to the rite. That's subject and a subjective experience of evidence. That's what I mean by that. On a second domain, many magical practices claim that they change the person, so self-transformation, psychological transformation, or psychophysical transformation, because physical healing is also important in these domains. And then in the sweet medicine Sundance path, they have a system of Olarians, which is really miraculous abilities, precognition, telepathy, psychokinesis, and other stuff. These things are only trained in the higher gateway, so I don't know how they claim to do it, but if someone claims to do it, I'm still interested, you know. So these questions basically correspond to domain 2 of the matrix, the practical domain. How do people ascribe efficacy? How do they deal with ritual success and failure? How do they interpret the practices epistemologically? And how do they negotiate traditionality and creativity? So can the practices change? Do you have to follow the script like a slave, and these questions? So this is what interests me. Now, I will need to be a bit faster. I cannot give you this whole overview because I want to go into some detail with the Sundance. But I want to quickly outline 6 aspects of this group so that you get an understanding. And I will try to be quick. So the sweet medicine Sundance path is first of all an initiatory path. There are 3 types of initiatory pathways: the so-called gateway process, the pipe path, and the sweat lodge path. The gateway path process is the most important one because you become an initiate and then you go through 15 gateways in total. Each gateway has at least 8 huge ceremonies, and it kind of transforms yourself to become a proper shaman or a magician. The pipe path includes fabricating an own pipe, using the pipe. The pipe is your direct channel to Wakantanka, to the Great Spirit. And there are also degrees in what you can do with the pipe, what conjurations you are allowed to use, and so on. And the sweat lodge path is also very complicated. You learn how to lead sweat lodges, to do the fire, to build the sweat lodges, to do the conjurations in the sweat lodge, etc. Each path involves many years of practice. And the gateway process is the most extensive one. After decades of practice, you may only have arrived in gateway 7 or 8, but this is already much when you look at the ceremonies and the teachings. Yeah, there are various large yearly ceremonies, such as the sun dance, the eagle dance, the earth lodge, or the so-called ceremonial days. And these are open to non-initiates, so I could participate in all of these. The sweet medicine sun dance path is a so-called warrior's path. So a warrior is focusing on individuality, autonomy, and freedom. And in fact, after several years in this group, this is really a demanding thing. You leave the comfort zone all the time. So this is not couch potato new age stuff. The ceremonies are performed alone. Most practices work with deprivation of sleep, food, and space. It is not a planned path, so there are no psychoactive plants involved. They claim that the ceremonies take the role of the plant. So they deviate from Castaneda in this way. Yes, and then rainbow, the path wants to produce rainbow warriors. And you find more information on this in the glossary. But that's quite important. So it's quite a demanding path. But yes, and this also poses the question, why do the people undergo this? Okay, because it's really demanding. So there must be a reward. This is what interests me. The sun dance path is also a dreamer's path. Following the books of Carlos Castaneda, dreams are very important in this group. All aspects and experience of human life are considered dreamlike, and 9 types of dreams are distinguished. Everyday reality, for instance, is the personal dream of the Shide, the so-called lower self. I only have this in German because this book, for whatever reason, they didn't publish it in English. I don't know. So in everyday life, we can either be on the west, the daydream, which is slept. This is the zombie-like life. You're like a billiard ball and you make no choices whatsoever. You're pushed around by life and yeah, you're basically sleeping while being awake. In the southwest is the shadow dream. It's the usual dreams that we have. Shadowy, we have no control. We're confronted with fear, anger, negative emotions. Those are the shadow dreams. And most people, according to the Sweet Medicine Sun Dance path, might be in these 2 realms. They have no control over life, over day life, and over night life. And the Sun Dance path wants to get a foot in the door of day life and night life. And I will not go into detail here, but they have elaborate teachings on how to take control over your dreams. So practice so-called controlled dreaming, or also mirror dreaming, as they called it. And by taking control over the dream, you actually take control over the daydream too. So this is just one aspect of it. There are many more aspects. By the way, this is one of the wheels. They distribute knowledge always according to the 8 cardinal directions. I will go into this soon. Yes. So this is also important. Medicine wheels, as I've just shown, most of the teachings that you receive, they are taught according to a circular graph, like the one you've just seen, like 8, which includes 8 concepts around the 8 cardinal and non-cardinal directions. Sometimes there are also concepts in the center, and all knowledge in the Sundance path is organized in this way. And let's have a look at an example, another example, the so-called Star Maidens Circle. It's allegedly the most important. The resolution is not so good. It's very good here. Anyway, this is just to get an impression how complex this is, because in this case 3 wheels are put on top of each other, because all the things that are in the east correspond to all the other hundreds of wheels to the things which are in the east. So you can put wheels on top of each other, and then you see correlations between the different teachings. And this is just an example what you can do with such a wheel. For instance, here you have 8 concepts in the Star Maiden Circle. For instance, mythology and entertainment in the south. And then you do a ceremony, you put stones around yourself, and you have create a stone circle. And then you can look at the 8 wheels of the 8 Speichen. Nein, nicht spines. Spikes, no. Spokes. When you look from outside to the center in the south, you can look, for instance, where mythologies have influenced your life in a negative way. So these are the shadow principles. When you sit in the center and look to the south from the inside to the outside, you look at what mythologies have brought you lightful in life. That's just one example of one of these 8 aspects, and you do it in a whole circle, and you can do this a whole night, for instance, like I have done it. So that's an example what you can actually do with these wheels. Much is first of all about getting self-knowledge more deep, or deeper self-knowledge with the aid of these tools. They are also called, as I wrote, I think, weapons against the ego. Considered weapons to conquer the enemy within. So that's also an aspect of the warrior. The rainbow warrior is that he conquers the shadow within. Another example, the Sundance Path, Sweet Medicine Sundance Path, has an extremely complex system of the human body-mind complex. They call it luminous egg cocoon or human flowering tree. They distinguish 5 senses, 10 eyes, 5 ears, 5 illusionary states of consciousness, 5 different types of attention, 10 chakras, 5 shields, 7 dances, and 3 assemblage points. And there are teachings and ceremonies for each of these concepts, and I will only show a few here. These are the 10 chakras. They distinguish 10 chakras. Swifty claims that he did not adopt this from Hindu systems or tantric or tantrism, but that there is a Cherokee word for chakra, and he simply used chakra as the translation, because most people in his time knew the chakras. So, just as a side note, otherwise you could think that this is taken from just some chakra books in the 1970s New Age shop. But this also comes with elaborate ceremonies, so-called 10 wheel balancing, a partner exercise where you, for 1 to 2 hours, clean the different regions of the aura with crystal, by the way. Different types of crystals, even different types of crystals. Then they have a complex, really complex theory of 5 shields, which are energy fields in the aura, and the different shields transport different aspects of our personality. For instance, in the north is the adult substance shield with our mind and the mental concepts, and in the south is the child substance shield with our emotions, especially our unsolved childhood emotions. And as normal grown-ups, we are usually either in the mind or in the emotions, so we are only in these 2 shields. But there are more shields, especially in the east and west, and they in this path you try to do shield work where you align the shields and conquer the east and west shield, because they are relevant for doing magic. But that's a very simplified explanation. And this is also very interesting. They have a system of so-called conscious assemblage stations. So the consciousness is usually on one of these points, either on top. So these are like the less evolved consciousness points, 1 to 4, and then 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And over the course of time and your gradual development, you try to make your way further down. So this is also something which I've never seen in any other system before. And they have a lot of ceremonies for this, but also very concrete practices. For instance, using a big crystal and pulling down the assemblage, the consciousness, 2 or 3 assemblage point down to station 6, which is the station of benevolent compassion, where you ought to reside and do most ceremonies. This is just a very brief overview so that you can get an understanding of the complexity of this. Now, twisted hairs. They also call the path twisted hairs. It means that its praxis knowledge is taken from multiple sources. So Swiftier said that he includes non-Native American sources if it works, knowledge that works, okay? And in fact, when you go through the teachings, you find a lot of examples, stuff taken from Carlos Castañeda, also terminology like tonal and nagual. There is a huge system of teaching which relies on the terminology of Wilhelm Reich, his character, personality types, 5 personality types, and there is also a long ceremony in the Sweetness and Sundance path called bodily de-armoring, where they try to remove the bodily armor and work on these personality types. Then there is stuff apparently taken from Tantrism. I cannot explain else in a different way. So they work with mantras, yantras, and mudras. And as I heard, Swiftier was working with Tibetan Buddhists in the 1980s. So it's quite clear that he picked up practice from many different sources. Kudoshka has a lot of influences from sex magic and also sigil magic. These are typically Western ritual magical teachings. He employs Sanskrit or Hindu terminology, has reincarnation concept, and also he uses acupressure points, maybe taken from his martial arts training. And then the ceremonies, they have many aspects that I also know from Western ritual magic, but then they have also aspects which I've never seen before. So it's a huge combination, but I think it's too easy to classify this path as a mere New Age hodgepodge, okay? It's much too easy, because many ceremonies which I have also witnessed and where I've partook, they clearly go back to Native American traditions, especially the big four, the sun dance, the eagle dance, the sweat lodge ceremony, and the pipe ceremony. The latter two, they seem to also include some New Agey elements, but there's a lot of traditional stuff in there. It's really very complicated. And the degree of details in these ceremonies is astounding, at least to me, especially, for instance, regarding the construction of the arbor, ceremonial space during the sun dance, the sweat lodge, or the fabrication of one's pipe, and the symbolic stuff that one needs for the pipe, and so on and so forth. I also heard many, many songs of traditional 1 or 2 beat songs in the drummers and singers groups, and I compared it a bit to stuff which I found on in the Native American communities. And so, and then there is plenty of peculiar ceremonies and symbolism, which are clearly not derived from Western magic or esotericism. So it is, in my humble opinion, impossible to make this all up. It's not superficial, it's really very complex. And if Swifty was a conman, like many people on the internet claim, he must have been super brilliant, and still it remains unexplainable how he got hold of so many detailed ceremonial scripts and why he's able to explain them in great depth. So this is still something I struggle with, the mixture of the whole thing. And in fact, when you look at some teachings and also practices, the Sweet Medicine Sundance Path claims to be one of 8 big religious groups. They are here, the Turtle Island Power, and they do acknowledge and include knowledge from all the other religious, teachings that have come, that have been produced by humans, or, yeah. And this is an image from the Sundance, and it's not so easy to see, but the 8 wheels with the 8 big religious groups of the world, you see on the top right. So this is always on the radar. Oh my gosh. So the Sundance. Okay. The Sweet Medicine Sundance Path obviously practices 2 Sundances per year, one in Arizona around solstice and one in Sweden a few weeks later. It is the most important ceremony of this group. It lasts 10 days. With 3 days of pure dancing and 7 days of pre and post preparation. I partook in this year's Sundance in Sweden. Let's go a bit into the history of this ceremony. The historical roots of the Sundance lie, of course, in the dark. As far as I understood from reading the historical literature, it spread across the Great Plains sometime after 1800. Where it was practiced every summer by the Cheyenne, Ponca, and Kiowa tribes. One of the first descriptions, namely by the French cartographer Joseph Nicolet, reads like this. They dance with their eyes open, so this is from 1838, to the sun all day and night for as long as possible without eating or drinking. As they dance, they blow the whistle associated with war, while the old ones sing. When they faint, they are revived with herb. The Sundance was variously described as a war, a hunter's, a fertility, a visionary, or a wish fulfillment ceremony. So there are many different ways the ceremony was practiced in different tribes with different intentions. Interestingly, it was banned, officially banned in the US between 1876, when the so-called Indian Act was launched, and 1978, when the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was published. So it was officially banned for roughly 100 years. So the Native Americans were not allowed to practice it, but many tribes practice it nonetheless, but they had to do it under the radar. It was practiced by numerous tribes in different ways, so it can rather be thought of as a ceremonial complex with various components. There is no authentic way of doing it. There are many different ways of doing it. But when I look at the many different descriptions that I read, there are fixed components. Sweat lodges before and afterwards. It's usually 2 to 3 days. It includes fasting and often dry fasting. There are separate groups of drummers and singers. Often there are elaborate body paintings with ceremonial cloth, and they have whistles with feathers. There are flexible components. It can be a full or a half circle. There is a center pole, or there are multiple poles. There is a circular movement around the pole, or there is an individual movement towards the pole and backwards. There is a tent on top of the dancers, or there is no tent. They could stare into the sun or towards the center pole. They use plants, or they don't use plants. Different dancer groups are described. Sometimes only young male warriors, sometimes mixed genders, and different groups, no children usually. The biggest thing where you might have heard of the ceremony is the self-sacrifice, the breast piercing. So this seems to be a quite stable pattern, ceremonial pattern. At some point, the dancers do breast piercings and they hang themselves towards the pole and go into a painful back movement until they receive a vision. And yeah, this could be done by individuals or several people. And yeah, these are a few pre-modern images that I found. This is the Sochons, a picture from 1925. I find this very interesting because it looks very similar to what I have done. They have these whistles with feathers. They have eagle feathers in their hands. They have skirts with fransen, or however you call that. They dance towards a center pole. This is another image from 1910. That's a Cheyenne Sundance. You can also see the whistles with feathers. Again, whistles with feathers. This time, these are crow. And here you see the piercing. There are two types of piercings. One is either through the breast, and another one is piercing through the back. And with these back piercings, you would actually pull the skull of a bull through the ritual site. Now, this is just some context. The Sundance, which I practiced, has a round arbor with some 150 lanes. One lane is one lane for one dancer. So we were 150 dancers. It has a center pole, so-called tree of life. It takes 10 days, 3 days of dancing, and the rest, the building of the arbor and the deconstruction, is part of the ceremony. There was no self-sacrifice apart from fasting, and a small group dry fasted for 3 days. It's open to all grown-ups, including non-initiates like me, and teenagers who completed all rites of passage. The Sundance equipment for dancers includes a skirt with fringes, colored ribbons, a belt, an eagle's whistle, 2 hand feathers, a medicine carpet, and a self-drawn Sundance shield, and body paint. 4 sweat lodges before and 1 afterwards, and plenty of other ceremonies. The dancing goes from 6 a.m. in the morning until 2 a.m. in the morning. So 20 hours of pure dancing for almost 3 days while fasting. I didn't do dry fasting. So basically how this works is that you have your lane. Behind you, you have a small bed with your stuff, and this is the so-called dream space. You can sit down in your dream space and take notes and do other stuff. But as soon as you're in the so-called arbor, the sacred space between the dream space and the tree of life, you have to dance. And you are never allowed to turn your back towards the tree. So you dance back and forth with the feathers and the whistle in the mouth. That's basically how it works. You utter prayers into corn paho, that's a small powder, or you can use a prayer cigarette. Then you dance for the prayer that you just uttered, and you whistle and shake the feathers. Just two images. There you can see the lanes. They are in fact quite small, so it's very intimate with your partners next to you, left and right. The beds are also next to each other. And my biggest fear was lying next to a snoring person, so I bought the most efficient earplugs that you could get on the market, but I was lucky. And that's how I look like. So you see the feathers, the feather whistle. And in fact, I saw videos and images which are exactly like that. So it's really a tradition. It's really a traditional ceremony. The purposes. Why is this done? Many different purposes. These are the public or the official purposes: clean water, clean air, fertile earth, and so on. So the ceremony, the big purposes of the ceremony are, well, improving the world, we might say. But then, yeah, how does this work? I could go into great depth now with the theory behind this, but in general, the arbor is considered a Nagwal space. So when you're on the dancing field, you're in the space beyond space and time, in theory. So when you utter your prayer on this area, you can plant a seed for the so-called tonal reality, so your everyday life after the ceremony. That's one of the ideas, and this is full of symbolism, how it is constructed. It is constructed in a very specific alchemical manner, and basically every microscopic detail that you see anywhere has a symbolic meaning to enable this efficacy which is ascribed to this ceremony. Now, I did not systematically interview other sun dancers this year regarding the effects of the ceremony, because that's what I'm basically interested in. Why should you do this? This is very demanding. So there must be a benefit or a reward. And an often heard observation is that one's life energy, which they call orende, that's their term for life energy, is much higher after a dance, and this stays so for many months. So when you do one of these dances every month, you have a much higher general life energy during the dance. And I also had quite a few visions and visionary experiences. And I think this is just plausible because there is deprivation of sleep, food, and space, and exhaustion, because after one day you're basically like a dead fly in the spider's net. Without food, dancing the whole day, you don't know where the energy is coming from, but then suddenly the energy comes back and you continue dancing, and that's how you move on. So, of course, through the setting, you go into very different states of mind. And I don't know if I mentioned this in the beginning, but in this fieldwork, I want to include my own experience as empirical data. So I didn't do proper interviews yet, but I can take my own diary, which I wrote while I was in this. And I would say, so basically you pray the whole day, okay? And at some point you run out of prayers. So your prayers come from somewhere else, from hidden parts of your personality or whatever. And of course, if this is a wish fulfillment ceremony, I want to see some of these prayers manifest later. And in general, I would say some have worked out, others not, but I wouldn't know if they would not have worked out anyway. So that's that. And the biggest effect that I felt was a general feeling of connectedness to all other participants after the Sundance, not in the Sundance. The Sundance is hard. And this was for me astounding because I never had such a feeling before, and it lasted for several hours. Now, that's just one example of one ceremony, and it's quite superficial how I present it, but still I wanted to give you one idea of one of these ceremonies. Just 3 concluding remarks. Even though this path is a small movement with a few thousand practitioners, its praxis knowledge is extremely complex. It is in fact the most complex system of teachings and practices which I've come across in my whole career in the study of the history of religions. A co-dancer and I used to call it Indianer-Universität because these people, they study this for 20 years and they, and in fact they have very hard prerequisites for achieving certain statuses and gateways. For instance, when you want to become a so-called SPC, a sacred pipe carrier, I think the written exam lasts 8 hours. That's more than in this university any exam lasts. This overview touched only on the tip of the iceberg, and I still wonder how this path can be studied and described properly without being superficial or hasty or unfair. So this, I'm still trying to figure that out. And what struck me personally while preparing this lecture is that I really understood better the channeling aspect. For me, this gives a new perspective to the question of the group's alleged traditionality and, to quote Raquel Romberg, its politics of authenticity. I'm through with what I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention.